Imagine standing at the edge of a map where the ink simply runs dry, staring into the silent, frozen shadows of the world's tallest peaks. For centuries, the people of the Himalayas have spoken of a creature that walks where humans cannot, a guardian of the high-altitude wilderness known as the Yeti. It is a name that evokes a sense of primal dread and wonder, a lingering ghost from a time when the world was much larger and more mysterious. We often think of our planet as fully mapped and conquered, yet there are still vertical deserts of ice and rock that remain stubbornly out of our reach. What if the legends of a wild man in the snow aren't just folklore, but the distorted reflection of a biological reality we have yet to fully grasp? The story of the Yeti is more than a monster hunt. It is a journey into the deep history of our own evolution and our relationship with nature. Ancient Tibetan traditions describe the Meto Kangmi, or abominable snowman, not as a beast, but as a being that occupies the thin space between animal and human. To the local Sherpas, the Yeti is a physical reality of the landscape, as certain as the biting wind and the thinning oxygen of the death zone. These stories aren't just campfire tales. They are woven into the spiritual fabric of the mountains, representing the untamed power of the earth itself. But in the mid-20th century, these local whispers crossed the oceans and transformed into a global obsession that captured the imagination of the Western world. Explorers like Eric Shipton brought back photographs of massive, five-toed footprints pressed into the pristine snow of the Menlung Glacier in 1951. These images sparked a feverish era of Himalayan fever, where every strange shadow or tuft of hair found on a ridge was seen as definitive proof. We are a species of storytellers, and we have a deep-seated psychological need for there to be something else out there in the great unknown. This curiosity is a double-edged sword, leading us to find patterns in the chaos and to see faces in the shifting mists of the high mountains. Is the Yeti a relic of our past, a cousin that survived the end of the last ice age by retreating to the most inaccessible corners of Earth? Or is it a mirror of our own fears, a personification of the isolation and the lethal indifference of the high-altitude environment we try to navigate? To find the truth, we have to look past the sensational headlines and dive into the cold, hard data of modern biology and evolutionary genetics. We must ask why such a specific image, a large, bipedal, hairy primate, persists across so many different cultures and so many different mountain ranges. If a large mammal were to hide from us today, the Himalayas would be the perfect fortress, a labyrinth of valleys where no human foot has ever stepped. Our search begins not with a sighting, but with a question. How much of the natural world is still hiding right in front of our eyes? To understand the Yeti, we must first look at the environment that supposedly birthed it, the high Himalayas, a place where biology is pushed to its absolute breaking point. At these altitudes, the air is so thin that every breath provides only half the oxygen found at sea level, making survival a specialized craft. If a large primate were to live here, it would need radical physiological adaptations to handle the extreme cold and the lack of reliable food sources. Science tells us that most large mammals in these regions, like the snow leopard or the yak, have evolved thick fur and massive lung capacities. But primates are generally tropical creatures. Our family tree is rooted in the warm, lush forests of Africa and Southeast Asia, not the frozen tundra. This biological mismatch is the first major hurdle for the Yeti legend. How did a great ape end up in the world's most hostile freezer? The answer might lie in the deep past, with a real giant that once roamed the forests of nearby southern China and Vietnam, Gigantopithecus blacki. Standing nearly 10 feet tall and weighing over 1,000 pounds, Gigantopithecus was the largest primate to ever walk the earth, a true king of the apes. Fossil records show that this massive relative of the orangutan lived alongside early humans for hundreds of thousands of years before vanishing. Mainstream science concludes that Gigantopithecus went extinct roughly 300,000 years ago, when the climate changed and its bamboo-rich forests disappeared. However, some researchers wonder if a small population could have survived by migrating higher into the mountain foothills, adapting to a new way of life. This relict hominoid theory suggests that our ancestors' encounters with these real giants may have been preserved in the cultural memory of mountain tribes. It's a compelling idea, a living fossil hiding in the clouds, a bridge between the prehistoric world and the modern era of satellites and drones. But modern science requires more than just maybe. It requires physical evidence, and for decades, that evidence consisted of mysterious Yeti relics kept in monasteries. In places like the Pangboche Monastery, monks guarded what they claimed were the scalps and skeletal hands of Yetis, treating them as sacred artifacts. These objects became the holy grail for cryptozoologists, eventually leading to high-stakes expeditions funded by wealthy adventurers and even the US government. In the late 1950s, the explorer Peter Byrne famously smuggled a piece of the Pangboche hand out of Nepal to be tested in London. The results were initially inconclusive, adding fuel to the fire and making the Yeti seem like a legitimate mystery waiting to be solved by the right technology. We were looking for a monster, but the tools of the 20th century could only take us so far, leaving a gap where imagination could flourish. To get a definitive answer, we had to wait for the genomic revolution, the ability to read the very blueprints of life hidden in a single strand of hair. In 2014, the world of cryptozoology held its breath as a team of geneticists led by Professor Brian Sykes of Oxford University released a groundbreaking study. They had collected dozens of hair samples from across the Himalayas, specimens that locals and explorers were certain belonged to the legendary Yeti. Using mitochondrial DNA sequencing, the team sought to compare these mysterious fibers against a massive database of every known mammal on the planet. The results were a masterclass in the expectation versus reality of scientific discovery, stripping away the supernatural and replacing it with something unexpected. Two specific samples, one from Ladakh in India and another from Bhutan, showed a 100% genetic match to an ancient prehistoric predator. It wasn't an ape, it was a match for a 40,000-year-old polar bear jawbone found in the Norwegian Arctic during the Pleistocene epoch. This suggested that a previously unknown species of hybrid bear might be roaming the high Himalayas, a relic of an age when ice ruled the Earth. However, science is a process of constant correction, and just a year later, other researchers challenged the paleo-polar bear theory with new data. Reanalysis suggested that the DNA was actually from a rare subspecies of the Himalayan brown bear, likely degraded by time and environmental exposure. In 2017, biologist Charlotte Lindqvist led an even more comprehensive study, analyzing 9 different Yeti relics, including bone, tooth, and skin. Her findings were definitive. 8 of the samples belonged to local bears, Asian black bears, Himalayan brown bears, and Tibetan brown bears. The 9th sample, a supposed Yeti relic from a monastery, turned out to be the bone of a domestic dog, likely a Tibetan Mastiff. For many, this was the smoking gun that killed the mystery, proving that the Yeti was nothing more than a series of misidentified animals. But if the Yeti is just a bear, why does the legend persist with such vivid, human-like detail across such a wide geographic area? To answer that, we have to look at how the human brain processes fear and sensory information in extreme, high-stress environments. Psychologists call it pareidolia, the tendency for the brain to see meaningful images, especially faces and figures, in random or ambiguous patterns. When you are exhausted, oxygen-deprived, and staring into a swirling blizzard, a standing bear can easily transform into a bipedal monster. A bear's footprint in the melting snow can double in size as the edges thaw, leaving behind a massive, distorted track that looks hauntingly humanoid. We aren't just seeing creatures, we are projecting our own evolutionary anxieties onto the canvas of the natural world's most frightening spaces. But even as the biological evidence points toward bears, there remains a curious, lingering thread that science has yet to fully untangle. Even if we accept that many sightings are misidentified bears, a deeper mystery remains within the cultural landscape of the Himalayas. Anthropologists have noted that Himalayan folklore distinguishes between several types of wild beings, each with specific physical and behavioral traits. There is the shute, a large bear-like creature, but also the mite, which is described as distinctly primate-like and terrifyingly aggressive. This suggests that the local people aren't just confused by bears, they are categorizing a range of distinct experiences in the wilderness. While DNA testing has debunked many physical relics, it cannot easily sample the fleeting sightings that occur in the deepest, unmapped valleys. To truly understand the potential for a hidden species, we must look at the sheer scale of the Himalayan mountain range itself. It covers over 600,000 square kilometers, with vertical terrain so complex that a population of mammals could remain isolated for thousands of years. New species are still being discovered today, from the snub-nosed monkey in Myanmar to the olinguito in the cloud forests of the Andes. If a small, intelligent, and highly elusive primate adapted to these high-altitude refuges, could they successfully evade the gaze of modern technology? Consider the enigma of the Denisovans, a group of ancient humans who lived in Asia and left their genetic legacy in modern populations. In 2019, researchers identified a Denisovan jawbone found in a high-altitude cave on the Tibetan Plateau dating back 160,000 years. This proved that ancient humans had developed the genetic ability to thrive in thin air long before Homo sapiens arrived in the region. If these cousins of ours could master the mountains, it raises the haunting possibility of other branches of the human tree surviving in isolation. This is the relict hominoid hypothesis, the idea that we aren't the only ones who survived the evolutionary journey of the last million years. However, the lack of fossil evidence for a mountain-dwelling ape between the time of Gigantopithecus and today remains a massive scientific hurdle. Evolution usually leaves a trail of breadcrumbs in the form of bones and teeth, yet the Himalayan soil remains remarkably silent on the matter. Perhaps the environment itself is the enemy of evidence. The acidic soil and grinding glaciers of the high peaks tend to destroy organic remains. We are left in a state of scientific limbo, where the absence of evidence is not necessarily the evidence of absence, but a call for better tools. Today, scientists are turning to environmental DNA, or eDNA, which allows them to sample the water and soil of remote lakes for genetic traces. Every creature that drinks from a stream leaves behind a microscopic signature, a ghost in the water that modern sequencing can finally see. As we cast our nets wider with environmental DNA, we are discovering that the empty wilderness is actually teeming with the ghosts of biodiversity. But the Yeti mystery doesn't just exist in the soil or the water, it lives in the complex relationship between human perception and environmental reality. Many skeptics point to the ecological rule of population density. A large primate requires a massive amount of high-calorie food to maintain its body heat. In the desolate, rocky heights of the Himalayas, there simply isn't enough vegetation or prey to support a breeding population of 1,000-pound apes. If the Yeti exists, it would need to spend most of its time in the lower, subalpine forests, only crossing the high passes occasionally. This matches the behavior of the Himalayan brown bear, which hibernates in the winter and roams vast distances in search of roots, insects, and small mammals. Yet, we must acknowledge that humans have a long history of being completely wrong about what is biologically impossible until we see it. For decades, the mountain gorilla was considered a myth by Western scientists, dismissed as a tall tale told by African tribes to frighten explorers. It wasn't until 1902 that Captain Robert von Behring finally proved their existence, revealing a massive, peaceful primate living in the mist. The Yeti could be our generation's mountain gorilla, a creature that exists on the very edge of our current ability to observe and document. However, the digital age has brought a new kind of scrutiny, a world filled with billions of smartphones and constant satellite surveillance of the Earth. In a world where we can track a single hiker from space, the hiding place for a giant primate is shrinking with every passing year. Every blurry video and grainy photograph in the age of 4K resolution becomes harder to defend as a genuine sighting of an unknown species. We have entered an era where hoaxes can be manufactured with AI and CGI, making the search for truth more difficult than ever before. This brings us to a crossroads in the Yeti narrative. Is it a biological entity we have failed to catch, or a psychological entity we refuse to let go? Perhaps the Yeti is a socially constructed reality, a necessary symbol that helps us process the overwhelming scale and danger of the mountains. By giving the mountain a face and a name, we make the terrifyingly indifferent forces of nature feel just a little bit more human. Even if every hair sample returns as bear and every footprint as Thor, the Yeti remains a vital part of how we interact with the unknown. It represents the part of us that still wants the world to be bigger than our maps, more mysterious than our databases can record. But before we close the book, we must look at the final, most haunting piece of the puzzle, the evidence of our own shared ancestry. Science is not a destination, but a flickering torch we carry into the dark, illuminating only what is directly in front of us. For all our DNA sequencing and satellite imaging, the high Himalayas remain one of the last great silence-filled theaters of our planet. Even if the abominable snowman never leaves a bone for our museums, the mystery itself serves a profound biological and philosophical purpose. It keeps us humble, reminding us that we are a young species still trying to understand the older, wilder world that gave us life. Our fascination with the Yeti is a lingering echo of a time when humans were not the undisputed masters of the food chain. It is a healthy fear of the shadows, a vestigial instinct that kept our ancestors alert and alive during the long, cold nights of the Pleistocene. Perhaps the true Yeti isn't a physical creature at all, but the feeling of being watched by the ancient mountains themselves. If we were to find a living Gigantopithecus tomorrow, the mystery would die, replaced by coordinates, Latin names, and biological constraints. The legend would become a commodity, and the magic of the unknown would be safely tucked away in a textbook or a zoo. There is a certain beauty in the things we cannot quite prove, the phenomena that exist just beyond the reach of our current technology. These mysteries act as the frontiers of our curiosity, pulling us forward into the mist to see what lies on the other side. As the climate changes and the glaciers recede, the landscape of the Himalayas is shifting faster than we can document its secrets. Ancient permafrost is melting, potentially revealing biological remains that have been locked in ice for tens of thousands of years. We may yet find the physical evidence of a lost branch of humanity or a giant ape that survived longer than we ever imagined. But until that day comes, the Yeti will continue to walk through the dreams of explorers and the prayers of mountain monks. It will remain the guardian of the high passes, the personification of the world's untamed and unreachable places. We should hope that some corners of our world remain unmapped and that some questions remain stubbornly and wonderfully unanswered. Because a world without mysteries is a world where we have stopped looking up at the stars and into the shadows. So the next time you look at a photograph of a distant, snowy peak, ask yourself, what else might be staring back at you? The Yeti may or may not be out there in the snow, but it will always be alive in the vast, unexplored mountains of the human mind.